Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. You know, every single one of us wrestles with this fascinating question. Where exactly do we draw the line on compromise? We are constantly trying to balance our deeply held beliefs with a culture that just keeps shifting around us. But how do we actually know when it's time to stand firm and when it's okay to bend? Well, to figure that out, we're going to unpack a profound historical text from the book of Ezra, and we'll see how these ancient dilemmas perfectly mirror our modern struggles. Let's dive in.
Okay, picture this. You're in a shared room. One person really wants to smoke, and the other person absolutely hates the smell. Whose side do you take? Well, today, that's just common sense, right? The smoker is entirely expected to step outside and accommodate the non-smoker. It is an undisputed societal norm. But culture is a moving target.
If we just rewind a few decades, the culture was completely flipped. Back in 1987, people literally lit up in university libraries, and flight attendants were practically handing out cigarettes on commercial airplanes. Back then, the culture entirely catered to the smoker, and the non-smoker was just expected to quietly endure it. It just goes to show how a massive cultural paradigm shift can completely rewrite the rules of what we consider normal.
So, as the world completely shifts around us, people of faith are forced to ask a really tough question. How much of my faith should I compromise? When the culture changes, should the church just change right along with it? Like, public street preaching used to be highly celebrated, but today, a lot of communities have totally adapted how they do outreach. Where is the actual line between adapting to our culture and, losing our core beliefs?
Think about the massive shift in church music. Back in the 70s and 80s, a lot of older generations strictly banned drums and electric guitars. They literally condemned them as unbiblical. But today, modern worship bands are widely accepted almost everywhere. The truth is, those instruments were never actually a threat to the core faith. They were just an unfamiliar culture that an older generation mistook for spiritual compromise.
This means we have to be super careful. We have to meticulously untangle our familiar religious culture from the actual realm of salvation. Take the Korean Protestant Church, for example. Their strict bans on drinking and smoking didn't come from some ancient theology. Early U.S. missionaries actually instituted those rules just to protect new believers from the rampant late 19th century societal vices of gambling and opium. It's a cultural boundary. It's not the absolute essence of the gospel. And if we don't know the difference, we end up fighting the wrong battles.
And look, when we confuse culture with core truth, we hit a massive identity crisis. Honestly, no one understood this better than the ancient Jewish community returning from the Babylonian exile. After 50 grueling years as captives, they were finally allowed to go home. But as they stood there in the ruins of their city, they were hit with this exact question: who are we, and who actually belongs to us?
42,360. That is the exact number of dutiful Jewish exiles who formed the very first wave of the return. For 50 years in Babylon, they had meticulously, fiercely preserved their identity and their faith. So when King Cyrus finally gave the green light, these hardliners packed their bags immediately. They were ready to rebuild a pure community. But, surprise, their homeland wasn't exactly empty.
The geopolitics here are just fascinating. Let's rewind a bit. 200 years prior, the Assyrian Empire conquered northern Israel and forcibly mixed the populations, which created a heavily blended culture. Then, 50 years prior, the Babylonians conquered southern Judah and took all the leaders away. So when those 42,360 devoted exiles finally stepped foot back in their homeland, they walked into a land filled with people of mixed heritage who had been practicing a blended religion for 2 centuries.
The book of Ezra uses a pretty harsh definition for these locals. It literally calls them the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. See, when Assyria had conquered the region, they intentionally scrambled the demographics specifically to prevent rebellions. So these locals were of mixed heritage. Sure, they worshipped the God of Israel, but they also worshipped local Canaanite gods. Their religion was this tangled, messy mix of traditions.
But here is where the story takes a really wild turn. When these locals saw the returning exiles starting to rebuild the temple, they approached them with this surprisingly friendly pitch. They said, "Let us build with you, for we seek your God as you do." They literally wanted to join forces, blend their communities together, and build as one. So, how did the returning Jewish leader, Zerubbabel, handle this olive branch? With a harsh, uncompromising rejection. He basically shut the door right in their faces, saying, "You have nothing to do with us. We alone will build." This singular, incredibly blunt rejection set off a massive historical conflict, and it led the rejected locals to actively sabotage the temple construction for decades.
I want you to pause for a second and weigh this heavy moral dilemma. Was Zerubbabel actually right to do that? I mean, from our modern, highly inclusive perspective, it seems incredibly stubborn, maybe even elitist, right? If he had just compromised a little and welcomed these locals, he probably could have avoided centuries of conflict. So was this harsh rejection truly necessary?
Well, put yourself in his shoes for a minute. He wasn't just being petty. He was fiercely protecting the pure, surviving seed of his faith. If their tiny, fragile population blended with a much larger syncretic religion, their core truth would be totally swallowed up. And remember, religious compromise is exactly what caused God to send them into that agonizing 50-year exile in the first place. They learned the hard way that mixing core truths with outside idols literally leads to destruction.
So at that exact moment, Zerubbabel's firmness was a necessary boundary for absolute spiritual survival. But, and here's the tragic irony of the whole thing, watch what happens next. Over the centuries, the descendants completely forgot the original spiritual purpose of that boundary. It stopped being about protecting the truth and just morphed into cultural superiority. A boundary meant to protect a fragile seed decayed into a toxic, ugly wall of prejudice against outsiders.
Because of that ancient rejection, those mixed heritage locals eventually became known as the Samaritans. Fast forward 500 years to the New Testament era, and the animosity between Jews and Samaritans was absolute. It was intense. Jews would literally walk days out of their way just to avoid setting foot in Samaria. What started as a theological boundary for survival had completely calcified into pure, cold prejudice.
And that is exactly why the actions of Jesus were so utterly revolutionary. He arrives on the scene and intentionally shatters this 500-year-old wall of prejudice. Instead of walking around Samaria like everyone else, he walks directly into it. By sitting at a well and offering living water to a Samaritan woman, he looked right past centuries of cultural hatred and chose radical warmth and grace instead.
There is such profound, poetic justice in Jesus' final command to his disciples. He tells them, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Think about that. The very people, the exact land that was uncompromisingly rejected by Zerubbabel for the sake of survival, now became the primary, specifically named destination for the gospel of grace. The wall finally came down.
So, what's our ultimate takeaway here? I think we are called to hold two incredible realities in tension. We absolutely need Zerubbabel's firmness. When it comes to the absolute bedrock foundation of our faith, we simply cannot compromise with a shifting culture. But at the exact same time, we have to embody Jesus' warmth. To actually reach people, we have to break out of our comfortable cultural bubbles, cross those boundaries, and show radical compassion. We need the firm spine of truth and the open arms of grace.
So, I want to leave you with this thought. Take a really close look at your own life and your own beliefs. Are the boundaries you've drawn genuinely there to protect the core truth of your faith? Or have your cultural habits, over time, quietly turned into a cold wall that you just use to judge and keep others out? It takes immense wisdom to know the difference, and incredible courage to tear down the walls that just don't belong. Thanks for joining me today.